So we're going to talk a little bit about client object model today. I know this is going to really disappoint all you devs, but I only have about a dozen slides, and the rest is going to be live demo. Is that cool? We can do that? All right. Who said no? There's got to be an admin in this room somewhere. How'd they get in? They're probably hiding in the back. Out with you. All right. So I see a lot of familiar faces that I've seen here before. So for those of you who don't know me, I have a particularly bad southern accent, and I also spend a lot of time in your country, so I tend to use English phrases in a southern accent, which is really confusing, especially to all my redneck friends back home. I have no idea what I'm talking about. So if I lose you at some point, or I get to talking too fast, because I have a tendency to do that from time to time, I'm from Texas, not Mississippi. Just hold up your hand, give me two hands, let me know I'm going a little too fast, and I'll slow down. If you have questions while we're talking, please, if they're relevant to what we're talking at the moment, raise your hand, let me know, and we'll try and hit them then. If it's just something general you want to hold till the end, we'll try and leave a little time at the end. For those of you who are in the back, I was noticing in Andrew's presentation that the code is a little bit hard to see. I've got the font dialed up in Visual Studio, but we are going to do a lot of demo, so give me a wave or something. You can't see any way back there anyway, McDermott. Give me a wave if you're having a hard time seeing the code, and I'll dial the font up a little bit, but with the compression on the monitors, it's a little bit hard to see, but we'll give it a shot. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Eric Shupps. I'm a SharePoint server MVP. Been around this game far longer than I probably needed to. They should have put me out to pasture probably a long time ago. I'm a member of the Patterns and Practices Advisory Board. How many people have downloaded the guidance from Patterns and Practices, SPG? Very good. Excellent. For those of you who haven't, we spent a lot of time and effort. Some of the best developers in this game were involved in that project. In helping develop some code samples and guidance for you around 2010. There's a lot of good stuff. spg.codeplex.com. I highly recommend you go and get it. There's also a book out now that takes a lot of that guidance that we built for that and puts it together into a book. You can hit me on the web or on my blog. Twitter and Facebook are on there. If you think you're going to get a response from me that way, you're wrong, because I'm never on there. Those of you who know me know. You can try, but if you have any questions for me, you need to get a hold of me, track me down this week, or hit me on my blog, post a comment, and I will get back to you that way. So let's get going. How many were in Tobias's Silverlight session this morning? Okay. I absolutely could not resist. Tobias had a placeholder in his slide deck that said, hunky-dory, jolly good awesomeness thingy. That's way too good to pass up. You got to put that in the deck. So that's Tobias's official quote. We're going to talk about client object model, the three different types, flavors, versions, what have you, that we can do with the client object model in SharePoint 2010. And like I said, we're going to cover the basics, give you a little bit of background for those of you who haven't worked with it before or new to it, and then we're just going to live code a WPF app with the .NET client OM, just see how it works from beginning to end. And if we're really, really lucky, when I press F5, it'll work. Odds are 50-50. Okay, client object model. How many people have written client object model code already? Yeah? Awesome. Good. Good stuff. Okay. So, old and busted. Everything was through the server object model. We had web services. We had localized dev. That was it. We got a little bit of WCF in there near the end of 2007. Nothing really to jump up and down about. But the remote story, let's be frank, in 2007 just wasn't all that good. They realized that was a problem, and in 2010 they have corrected that problem by introducing the client object model, which gives us a much better, more robust API for working with remote applications. It's relatively simple and easy to use. If you haven't done it already, I think you'll be surprised how easy it is to get going on the client object model. I would like to say it's fantastic and it's perfect, but it's not quite there yet. It's a very good first effort, and there's some good stuff in there. But as those of you who've worked with it before or already have found, not maybe everything you wanted in there is in there. It's not the most performant animal in the world, especially if you're doing Silverlight or JavaScript with the asynchronous events. So if you're in an environment where performance is a big concern, you may want to watch how much work you do in the client object model under those conditions. The good news is it supports a variety of different ways for the code that you're writing. If you're doing traditional WinForms-based development, if you're writing your own, say, WCF services or what have you that are on other types or remotely connected systems, you got the .NET version of the client OM, which you can also use in WPF. If you're doing Silverlight-based stuff, then you can use the Silverlight version, and if you're doing heavy client-side scripting, there is a JavaScript version, and they're all relatively similar. The JavaScript one a little bit different than the others, but for the most part, the syntax is about the same from one to one. And this is how this is the new hotness. This is what it looks like behind the scenes, is what's going on when you use the client object model. So what you're actually doing is you're making a call through a proxy to the server OM code that's running on the background, or I should say a subset thereof, via XML, and then getting back a JSON response that you're then working with locally in your code. And you're either doing it synchronously or asynchronously, depending on which model that you're using. Two important things here. Client service, right, which is only running on your web front ends. There is a limit in capacity for how much data the client service can manage, and it's not configurable, unfortunately. If you're in a very high volume environment with a lot of data being exchanged back and forth, you need to make sure you do some testing on the load on your web front ends for the client service. Number two, it is a, whoops, it's not on this slide. Okay. It is a subset of the server object model, so you don't have the full functionality that you get out of the server OM in the client OM. There's a certain subset of commands, hopefully, as we go forward. Those will be expanded, and we'll get some more of the server-side stuff. But a lot of it is missing there. If you're used to doing MOS programming or now server-side or server programming, you're going to be missing a lot of things that you're used to. If you're used to working with Foundation or WSS, most of that stuff is there, and you probably won't miss it. Syntax, pretty straightforward. Instead of SP objects, we just have the object itself. So instead of SP web, we have web, and it's the same across all three different versions. There's some differentiations in how you call things, which we'll look at on the JavaScript side, but most of your objects are the same. The very most important one is, you can't see my pointer up there, client context. This is what sets your capability to work with a particular site or site collection in SharePoint and actually begin exchanging data. Without it, you won't get very far. So, first thing that you need to do when you're working with the client object model is set up that client context. If you're working remotely disconnected, i.e. WPF or WinForms, then you can instantiate with a specific URL. If you're working in Silverlight or JavaScript, you can use the current context that you're in. So the same as calling spcontext.current. But that only works if you're hosted in the browser on the site. So it has to be either JavaScript or Silverlight. Most of the time, you'll instantiate with a specified URL. One of the biggest changes to working with the client OM is we're used to having everything sort of right at our fingertips, right? We go get list, and now we've got everything in the list that we could want. If we get a list item, we've got access to all of its fields, and so it's very easy to work with individual objects. This is not true in the client object model. You only get what you ask for. So if you want to access a particular property, or a particular field value, for instance, of a list item, you must ask for it in advance, or you will not have access to it. And the other side to that is you also have to put instructions together and hand them off to the server in a batch in order to get them back to work with them. Even when you're doing synchronous in the .NET version of the object model, you still have to put stuff together in a batch that gets submitted as a query to the server. You get the response back, and then you can work with it. So we have to know what we want before we ask for it. Then we have to ask for it, and then we can work with it. So a little different mindset from the way we're used to working with the server object model. There's also subtle differences between the way that you ask for things and how you handle them. In the .NET model, for example, you may make multiple queries to get one specific object and handle it synchronously as you're working down through your code. In Silverlight, because it's asynchronous, you tend to put big batches of commands together, hand them off to the server, and get them back. And then you have to create and manage the event handlers for those asynchronous events. The bigger and more complex your application, the more asynchronous events you've got running around, the harder it is to manage the timing of your application and make sure everything gets done in the right order. So this is how it looks. You have a set of commands. You call execute query. You pass off the XML to the client service. The client service then processes it, sends it back to you so that you can work with it in your code. Okay, limitations. The more you work with this, the more number one becomes a real issue. There is a lot, especially if you're doing Silverlight, a lot of asynchronous events that are happening. And I'm going to show you an example of a real-world application that has all kinds of this stuff going on. And it's very challenging to try and get all of your stuff working in the right order and make sure that you're handling things and they're not out of sequence, because it doesn't do any good to try and execute something if you haven't gotten the results back from the previous command that you executed. If you're used to working with run with elevated privileges, gone. Doesn't work in client object model. You cannot elevate privileges. All requests are subject to throttling. The client service, as I mentioned previously, has limited performance. Those requests are going to be throttled, and if your administrators have gone into the admin settings and set the HTTP throttling in central administration, that's going to impact your client object model calls to those front-end web servers. So you need to be aware of what that configuration looks like in your production environment to make sure they're not choking off all the bandwidth that you need to be using for your application. We already mentioned .NET has sync. Silverlight and JavaScript are asynchronous. It's a limited subset of the functionality, and you only get what you ask for, so make sure you're asking for the right thing. It's kind of like Christmas. Okay, .NET, this one's pretty simple, probably most straightforward for us to work with and get used to. Very similar to what we're already doing in the server OM programming, where we're simply writing our requests. We have to get used to making the execute and get the query and work with the stuff in the batch, but fairly straightforward. Much more lightweight when you're working with the client OM. It is a subset, and most of the work is happening on the back end that the service is talking to. So the DLLs are much more lightweight. By the way, you need to know which DLLs you're using because they're different for each type of operation that you're trying to perform, whether you're doing .NET or whether you're doing Silverlight. Those assemblies are different. These in Visual Studio 2010 are right there under the SharePoint tab. So you can go to SharePoint tab and say, I want to use the client. That will not work for Silverlight. They're in a different place. Silverlight. So 2010 has the native Silverlight web part, which is handy because all we have to create in our solution is a ZAP file, and then we can use a web part to host that ZAP file in SharePoint, which is easily done, very easy to deploy, and if you haven't done that before, I'll show you how you get those deployed into SharePoint. It's pretty simple. You can pass parameters into your Silverlight applications. So how many people have been writing Silverlight already in SharePoint? Most. That's what I figured. Okay, good. So this is just basic Silverlight stuff. You can pass parameters in from your website or from your web part. And the best part about it is because it's XAML, we're developers. We don't have to mess with the pretty GUI UI stuff. The designers can do that because we have real work to do. Any designers in here? Good. Okay, reference these DLLs when you're working with Silverlight. You need to make sure you get them out of the client bin directory. Those are the ones that are compiled to run with Silverlight. Remember that we are still in 3.5 on SharePoint 2010. We're not in .NET 4 yet. Make sure you're using the right references. Here's an example of some Silverlight client OM code. We're going to go deep into some code. I'm not going to spend any real time here. But just notice what's happening in the commands. We're setting a client context here, and then we're batching our commands together, and then we're sending them off through, in this case, an async operation. Right? So you put everything together, and then boom, you commit it in a batch, and then you jump into your success listener or your fail listener to see whether it's worked or it hasn't worked. Deploying Silverlight, I'll walk you through that. It's pretty straightforward. just deploys as a module. It's just a file that goes into a document library. Pretty basic, straightforward. JavaScript. This one gets a little bit tricky. The biggest challenge that you're going to have working with ClientOM and JavaScript is the fact that you're limited to the current site context only. You cannot go cross-site with JavaScript. Cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, that's why that limitation is in there. Browser won't let you do it, so you can't go outside. It's even more limited than the sandbox. You're just limited to your own site environment. Same sort of concept, context, items, objects, and then execute your query. Also async like Silverlight, but there are some small contextual changes. Instead of get web being one, it's get underscore web, get list, get item, etc. Not that big of a difference. Like I said, the big limiting factor is that you're only in one single site context and you can't go beyond that. Okay, that's all the GUI background stuff. Any questions on that so far before we start actually doing some code? Yes? No? Good. Go ahead. Pardon?
You said that you were limited by cross-site, by your browser wanting to use cross-site scripting, so you're limited to one site. Surely we're limited to one application.
So the question is on the comment I made about cross-site scripting. So it's the same concept as the browser limiting the execution of JavaScript cross-site. The JavaScript object, the portion of the client object model that's in JavaScript just follows the same principle. It's not using the same actual security boundary. It's just following the same principle of only limiting you to your current site context. And it's hard-coded, and there's nothing you can do about it. So you either have to go Silverlight or a .NET web part or choose something else. JavaScript just won't do it. Okay, so two things that I want to show you. One is an application that was actually built for Microsoft to use in the information worker demos. And they wanted, I'm not going to go deep into that code, but they wanted a couple of things to do as demos. They wanted to do them in Silverlight. They wanted something that was sexy. Why they gave it to me to make sexy, I have no idea. But they needed it all sort of bundled up and put together and deliverable. So I did it all in Silverlight using ClientOM. And the first thing that I wanted to show you is the solution structure for deploying your applications and projects into the client, into SharePoint when you're doing Silverlight development. So you can see the solution structure here. I'll point these out. I have a project at the top that's just a container project for deploying my package. And then I've got these are utility class for controls, and then I've got actual Silverlight applications for the calendar and the voicemail apps. Relatively straightforward solution structure. What's important to note here is that the results of your compilation in your two projects, zoom in on that, are actually being placed with the output directory into your packaging project. And all I'm getting is the zap file because that's all I need. I then reference those as modules that get deployed into SharePoint, right? So very basic, easy stuff. Here's just references my zap, says here's my URL, set it ghostable in library, and put it in there, right? Very basic deployment, and you can just F5 and send it off in there as you wish. Here's the other one for the calendar, and then the package itself. Nice and straightforward, and it just has these particular components. There's some lists and stuff for configuration and whatnot. The point I'm getting at is deploying this stuff into your dev environment when you're developing in Silverlight is really straightforward. Just set up the solution, F5 it, it gets put in there, and it's nice and simple. All right, here's what's not so simple. Let's open the code here and take a look at all the events that happen. So I should probably explain what this is doing. This particular piece of code goes out to Exchange and pulls a user's calendar and puts it in a nice grid with stack panels and all that stuff, and lets you look at your calendar from Exchange without the nasty OWA web parts cluttering up your page. So it's a nice slimmed down version of that. In order to do that, there were a number of things that I had to do. I had to get stuff out of the user profile database. I had to get stuff out of Exchange, working with Exchange Web Services. How many people have programmed against Exchange Web Services? You poor, poor souls. They're evil. Evil. Did I say they were evil? They do have a nice little client, Exchange client assemblies that you can use if you're writing in .NET that don't work in Silverlight. So you still have to do everything against Exchange Web Services. If you thought SharePoint Web Services were nasty, you ain't seen nothing yet. So there was a bunch of back and forth that had to go on. And what that back and forth involved was async events for all sorts of stuff that's happening. Those are click events. Let's get down here to, here's my calendar events. Cover flow, there's all sorts of events that are going on. Here's my success handlers and failure handlers, and there's a bunch of them, okay? If you run a trace on this to see what all the reference calls are, there are a bunch of them. This was a particularly nasty application to write because there's a lot of timing stuff when it loads. I have to get the user's picture, and I have to load up all their calendar events and put them into the right and into formatted month calendar and all this jazz. Making sure that I had all my calls going properly was exceedingly difficult because there's so much async stuff that's happening and trying to process all that. Be aware of that. You want to put some thought into your applications before you build them if you're going to use Silverlight and do a bunch of async stuff in the client object model. Really map that out. At one point I had to get out the whiteboard and just write out what's going where and when is it happening, so I make sure that I'm calling all my events in the right place to happen. And then, of course, when the user interacts, you want to make sure that you're not making excessive calls back and forth and so on. So a particular thorny application. FYI, I've finally gotten permission to release this code at SharePoint Conference in 2010, so we'll be doing the voicemail app or 2011 at SharePoint Conference in Anaheim and releasing this code. So unfortunately, I can't give this to you now, but I will soon. Okay, let's actually write, how are we doing on time? Good. Let's write a WPF application using the client OM from scratch, sort of. So I'm going to create a new WPF application. Incidentally, for those of you who aren't using it, you should be. Notice that I have a few artifacts in here that have a nice little extension on them called CKSDev. How many people are using CKSDev? That's good, but I see a lot of hands not going up. Okay? If your company hasn't specifically prevented you from using CKSDev, shame on you. Go out and download it right now. And I understand. For those of you who don't know, Waldeck is sitting right here in the second row, who's one of the primary authors on CKSDev. They're releasing a new version soon. 2 will be out sometime in the next month or so, maybe a little bit longer. There is a ton of cool stuff in CKSDev that will make your life so much easier. I recommend, and it's an extension, so you just go into the extension manager and just install it. Nice, neat, and simple. All right, so we're going to create a new WPF application. And before anybody says anything, because somebody will, no, I am not live coding MVVM. You're out of your mind. We don't have enough time for that, right? And it never compiles the first time anyway. So no, I'm not going to do that. But I will release an MVVM version of this code afterwards. There's a problem getting the slider control to work right with the relay commands, but I will fix it. Okay, so that's a problem when you don't get any XAML when you start a WPF application. That tends to not be good. Did I say we were live coding this? Maybe not. All right, let's try this again. So what we're going to do, if it decides to cooperate with me, is we are going to create a nice little WPF app. Here we go. Project director already exists. Well, of course it does. We're going to create a nice little WPF app that's going to go out to a SharePoint. There we go. That's better. We're going to go out to a SharePoint list. We're going to get some images out of a SharePoint list, and we're going to display them in WPF. So pretty basic, but I just want to walk you through all the elements of doing that. All right. So here we've got our grid. So naturally, I'm going to cheat and use snippets, if it will let me. Oh, it won't let me do it here. That's a bummer. Right. So pay no attention to the man behind the curtain as I'm about to cut and paste. or we're going to be here for quite a while. Let's open up the Julia Childs version that's already pre-baked and copy some code. There we go. That's what we want right there. And bang. Okay, so this is really simple. Again, I'm not a designer. I don't make things pretty. I just make them work. So I'm going to have a little image here. I'm going to have a text block underneath that shows the title, and I'm going to have a slider to move them back and forth through the objects that are in the library. So poor man's cover flow. Incidentally, there's some cool CodePlex projects that have a whole set of visual libraries for doing cover flow and object rotation and all that sort of stuff that you can get off CodePlex if you're doing a lot of WPF. They're really slick. All right, so a couple things that we need to do in order to get this guy to work. We need to have a couple of supporting classes to make this happen. We're going to have images that we're pulling from a library. So I'm going to have an image object that I can apply some properties to. So we'll start by adding a class for our images. And we'll just call this image.cs. And image.cs is going to have no... Oh. Where's my IntelliSense? Oh, it's going to like that better. Hey, looky there. All right. So we're going to have a nice little class here that has a few properties for us. So we'll have some public settings for the title, the URL, and we're going to set a bitmap image. In order to do the bitmap image, though, we need system.windows.media.imaging. Bang. There we go. Okay, so just a few properties that we'll set in getting our items from the list. That's nice and easy. The second thing we do is we need to actually write the code to go and get our objects out of our SharePoint list and into our WPF application. So I'm going to create another class, and we're going to call this one utility. Okay, and we're going to throw in some code, and there's no way I'm going to stand here and type all this, or we won't get out of here until next week. So let's do utility. Ooh, there's a bunch of code. All right, let's talk through it. Okay, first thing first, I'm making some references here that could use a little bit of help. So I need a reference to the proper assemblies. So I can do add reference, and Visual Studio 2010, you can just go here and you can grab these two guys right here. Remember, these will not work for Silverlight. These are the .NET references. So that's a good start. I need to using Microsoft.SharePoint.client. Yay. That'll make some things happy. And I need a system.collections.generic. There we go, and that'll get my observable collection for me to use, or should, once IntelliSense catches up, please. No? Right. Let's see if we've got a proper reference. Well, we do. That's not fair. Dot. That's what I thought. Okay. Very good. That should work, and it doesn't. System dot generic. Oh. How about if I choose the right one? Yay. I'm pair programming with 100 people and nobody caught that. Jiminy Christmas. All right. Let's talk about what we got going on here in all this code. Okay, first things first. Can we see the code in the back? Are we all right? Or need to dial it up a little more? Yeah, we're good. Okay. First thing we're doing is we're setting our client context. Okay, now, I'm in WPF, so I don't have a localized context to get from. So I'm going to have to get some context from somewhere. What I'm going to do in this utility class is I'm actually going to pass that in with some parameters here. So I'm going to pass in a site URL. I'm passing in a base URL for a specific reason, so I don't have to do a bunch of string parsing on the URL to get the images to show up. And then I'm passing in the list name. Okay? So we're going to use those parameters. We're going to establish a context here with our site URL. And we're going to do something that looks a little bit strange, which is we're going to make actually 2 batch queries. The first we're going to call the context load and get the site and execute that query so we have the site to work with, and then we're actually going to go and get our list. This is one of the tricky pieces of doing the .NET piece versus the Silverlight piece. In Silverlight, you would bunch all that together and hand it off to try and go get it. In .NET, you actually need to execute those in 2 separate batches so that you have the proper context to do this, which is to call site.lists and actually get your objects. The reason is because of this call right here where we're saying site.list. We're referencing an object that we don't have if we don't make that preceding execute query and pass in that batch. So we've got to get our object so that we can then work with it. That's the point of that. What? Yep. Well, of course you can if you want to. I don't know if there's a link statement that's actually shorter than that, but you could try. I should mention something on that point since you brought it up and since it came up in Andrew's discussion. Remember, link helps you. It doesn't help SharePoint. Okay? It's all camel on the back end. All the link you create is just generating camel queries on the back end. And if you're not careful, it can be generating inefficient camel queries on the back end. Right? Yes, it's easy. Nice little syntax for us to use, but it's still camel on the back end. Right? If you're used to writing camel and you don't want to mess with link, and you're old school like me, then you just write camel. And link won't work with things like external content types. Right? So there are some limitations there. Okay. I'm off my high horse. Okay. So we're going to go and we're going to get our list. We're going to pass in a camel query. We're going to get our list item collection. So you'll notice that these are just, instead of SP list, it's just list, right? Instead of list item or SP list item collection, it's just list item collection. Okay. Now, this is a part where we have to ask for what we want. Okay. Mom and Dad can't read our minds. We have to show them the page in the catalog with all the good stuff we want under the tree. So here we ask for it. Okay. So I'm setting up my expression here and looking for my items, and I'm asking for some very specific things. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. You don't actually need to be this specific when you're making the call in .NET, but you have to when you're doing it in Silverlight. Okay? There are some fields that are absolutely required: ID, display name, effective base permissions, and file system object type. Those have to come back. When you're working in Silverlight, you will get an error if you're trying to get list items and you're not asking for these things. What you don't have to do in the .NET piece is the additional piece that I'm doing here, which is asking for the extra fields. There's a different way to do that that's shorter. I left the example in here so that if you use this code in Silverlight, it will be correct. Okay? So I'm actually looking for 2 fields, title, and because it's an image, there's a little cheater field called required field that has the site relative URL that I can grab for that image. Okay? Remember, you have to ask for what you want in order to use it later. Then I'm going to execute my query. This is where, again, it's different from Silverlight. In Silverlight, this would be an asynchronous call, so we would have to set up 2 handlers for success and failure in order to start working with our objects. Because we're doing this in .NET, we don't have to do that. We can just move right along. Okay, I'm now creating an observable collection and just doing a quick check here to say, hey, if there's actually something in my list, set my image count, and create an image object that's going to go into my observable collection, right? So here's my image. I'm grabbing the field information here, putting the base URL in front of it, which I know is cheating, but and then I'm creating the bitmap image that we're actually going to load into the WPF app. You'll notice that it's got red squigglies. It doesn't like me very much. It wants me to go up here and add the imaging. Windows.media.imaging, bang. Okay. Now, I could have done all of this in the code behind for the, what's your problem? Oh, just now you figured out you can't connect to TFS. Okay. I could have done all this in the code behind here in main window XAML. Anyone tell me why I didn't do it that way and put it in a separate utility? Oh, come on. Why would I do it that way? Reuse. Okay. No. Actually, yes, if I'm going to do it that way. But there's another good reason. What is it? I'm sorry? You could. Thank you. I can unit test it. Exactly. That's why I abstracted it into a separate class. All those other reasons are good reasons. What's the big knock for not doing stuff without MVVM because it's not testable? That's not true. It can be testable if you abstract it properly. Okay? And I'm going to show you what Visual Studio thinks is unit testing for this particular class. So we've created our utility class here. All right, let's go back to it. So since we're talking about it, let's go ahead and if you're using Visual Studio 2010 SP1, you can now right-click and choose Create Unit Test. Pick your method that you want to unit test. What's your problem? Oh, there it is. Hello. Select. Thank you. Some days it just doesn't pay to get out of bed. Get back here. And create my unit test. Don't be difficult. Oh, I've never built this. It helps if there's an assembly. You know what would really help? If I signed it. That would help too. Yeah, It's not strong enough because there isn't one. Visual Studio is so helpful. All right. There we go. Now, perhaps we can build this guy. I thought I saw a build error. Did I? Ah, yes, indeed. Anybody know what's going on here? Thank you. When I created the project, I just picked WPF. But by default, Visual Studio assumes you want the new stuff. You have to tell it, nah, it's SharePoint. We want the old stuff because we're not hip and cool yet. Still running under 3.5. Interestingly enough, as you're going to see in just a moment, that isn't true for test classes. Okay. Now we can get somewhere. All right, create my unit test. And it says, okay, I just thought I did build it. Oh, I didn't. It failed. You're right. See, more build errors. Waldeck, I thought you fixed this. What's the deal? Right, V2. It's in V2, huh? All right. Now, by the time I've changed this 5 times, it's never going to build again.
Does this have to be 64-bit?
Huh?
Does this have to be 64-bit?
No, you can compile it for any CPU is fine. Yay, we built that time. Okay. However, there is something funky about that that you have to do for the testing that I'm going to show you in just a second. Okay. Now, if we're lucky, yay! Okay, now we can do our test. So we're going to call this image slider.wpf2.tests. All right. And generate some test methods. And very cool, we now have some tests down here. Hey, look at all this cool stuff that it gives me in my test. Awesome. I don't like any of it. Go away. And let's replace it with something a little more friendly to a demo, even though it's a really bad unit test. There we go. Okay. Is this really a unit test? It's not. It's an integration test. Why? Pardon? Because you're also testing SharePoint. Because the code that I'm calling is actually calling out to a live SharePoint instance, to a list, and getting objects back. Okay? That's not a unit test. Unit tests are isolated. SharePoint shouldn't have to be running on this machine at all for my unit tests to run. Okay? Yes, I told Mike Morton that. No, he didn't change it. They still call them unit tests. It's not my fault. Okay. So now I got my test, which is basically just coming out here and saying pass in some parameters, get back an observable collection, and say, does it have more than one list item in it? Okay, if you're going to run this now, something you need to know for the test, you do run in .NET Framework 4 for MS Test. However, in order to get your test to run, you need to come on here and edit your test settings. Well, you can do it right here as well. Come on. You need to edit your test settings, and you need to set it to hosts right here, and it has to run, force test to run in 64-bit machine. Boom, there you go. Now the test should run, and if we're really lucky, it will pass, or if there's TDD people out there, they'll be happy because it fails. All right, and run tests, and let's see what happens. Okay, what do we got here? Oh, it's just not happy. I did something wrong when I signed it. Okay, we won't get too far down the rabbit hole on that. My test didn't run. Are you TDD people happy? It failed. All right. I'll open the pre-baked demo and show you it running later. Okay, so let's move into our XAML. Let's actually get something built here. So we've got our utility class. Now we need a little bit of goodness going on in our XAML here. So we'll go to the behind. The mouse will cooperate here, and we'll do our little bit of stuff here. So we're going to set this up in here so we can pass in. That's not the right place to put that. Snippets are great until you put them in the wrong place. Okay. All right. Now I need a couple of references here, which I'm going to cheat and steal from here. Nobody look. Nobody look. Turn your head the other way. You didn't see me do this. Right? We're just going to cheat and grab all this stuff. And bang. There we go. Whoops. I am pointer challenged. Okay. There we go. All right. Now, a little more snippet here. We've set up our variables, and let's get this guy here. Okay. And it's going to do a couple of things. We're going to set an event handler for our sliders so that when we move things around, it'll know to change the images for us. And we're going to call our utility class here to get our list data, passing it in our stuff. We're going to set our maximum range on our slider, and we're just going to pick the default image. And then a little bit more setup here. We'll do this guy here. This, whoa, that's not good. It won't help at all if I don't actually have an event handler set up, will it? Bad snippets, bad snippets. More cutting and pasting. You didn't see this. Okay, there we go. So we've got our slider, and we're going to get the value that our slider's on. We're going to pick the image object out of the observable collection, and we're going to set it. Like I said, nice, neat, and simple. Should be easy enough, and if we're really super hyper lucky, it'll actually compile and run. All right, what are the odds? Will this work? Hands up who think this is going to work first try. I love it. All right. Ah, you're all right, too. I love it. Hey, what's that all about? Okay, it doesn't like the way that I signed this assembly. It's the same thing it was complaining about in our test, so let's go fix that, shall we? Right, sign the assembly. Let's create a new one. Key 2. Okay, let's try that. Save it. Build it. What are the odds on try number 2? Wow. Bummer, dude. What are we missing? Right. Okay. Let's go to the one that works, shall we? Ooh, watch. Hey. Huh? Good stuff. No builders. Huh? That's so bad. That's so cheating. Okay. So now I can scroll through my list of objects. Okay? And you'll see them moving as we go through. All these are coming from a SharePoint image library, right? And our WPF application is working and pulling data out of SharePoint with ClientOM. Okay? Good stuff. And just so you know that I'm not completely fooling, this really should, if we're lucky, on this one, run the tests. So let's see if it does run our unit tests. integration tests. Booyah! There it is. Our tests are good, and they passed. Okay, fun stuff. So, not that difficult. Some things you need to be aware of when you're working with the client OM, things to remember, executing things in batch, knowing when to ask for something to get it back, managing async stuff when you're working in Silverlight. And not everything you want is always going to be there the way that you want it to be if you were used to doing stuff with the server. However, for the most part, should give you just about everything you need for doing remotely disconnected applications with your SharePoint data. Got a few minutes left for questions. There were a bunch of people who said they were doing client OM development, so questions on doing this in the real world?